highly controversial Star Wars The Last Jedi has been announced for release on Blu-ray, 4K, DVD and digital for March the 27th. If you live outside of North America, you might even get a 3D release to go with that, depending on your territory. There is a lot to talk about here, so in this installment of Talking Blu, we will look into the details of the Star Wars The Last Jedi home video announcement. Then we will look into why there is no 3D release in North America, how this is the first 4K release of a Star Wars movie, and why 4K Ultra HD is a big deal. Joining me to discuss that is Bill Hunt and Tim Salmons from the Digital Bits.
Hello everybody.
Hello everybody.
We are also joined by Tom Connors from Midnight's Edge After Dark.
Hello again.
Before we begin, what did you all think about The Last Jedi as a movie?
Well, you know, it's funny. I saw this movie opening night with my wife and my friend Robert Meyer Burnett and his girlfriend, and when the movie was over, Rob and I were staring at the screen kind of contemplatively, and my wife leaned over and said, "Did you like it? Did you like it? I can't tell. Did you like it?" And the truth was, I had to think about it for a while before I really could kind of come to terms with my feelings about the movie, because it was so different than I expected. It was such a different story and such a different plot and kind of twists and turns than I was anticipating, that I really had to think about it for a while. And ultimately, the place I got to pretty quickly was, other than there are a few flaws in the movie, I think, in terms of some of the story kind of points, but I really liked the fact that it was not what I expected. I like the fact that, you know, it challenged my preconceptions about what a Star Wars movie should be and about what these characters were. I love, for example, that a lot of these sort of puzzle box questions that J.J. Abrams set up in The Force Awakens didn't get answered, because I think that's more true to life and it's more interesting. And I think, you know, some of the questions in terms of who were Rey's parents, things like that, I love that the answer was not always what she expected or what fans might have expected or what anyone hoped, because that's more interesting dramatically, seeing characters react to that. I think it challenges the characters and it makes the drama more interesting. I would have hated if that movie had played out in a way that I saw everything coming in advance. So while I know it's controversial, I really kind of like the fact that we didn't get answers to a lot of those questions, or that the answers were not what we expected. I know a lot of people had different sort of feelings about it. I know, Tim, for example, you had a very strong initial reaction to the film.
Yes, that's right. I didn't see the movie on opening night, but I saw it the following day. But my reaction was kind of the same, but way, way different. First of all, my viewing experience, I saw it at around 10 in the morning, and I was at an Alamo Drafthouse to see it. And normally when I go to see a movie at an Alamo Drafthouse, it's kind of a perfect experience seeing a movie, because they're very hardcore about people not talking during the theater, not having their cell phones out. But in this case, there were people in the theater being very talkative, and there was a guy behind me who obviously had some kind of problem, whether he was sick or whether he was something really wrong with him, but he was making a lot of loud breathing noise. So I had that constantly in my ear. And then the movie itself, like Bill was saying, is so different that my initial reaction to the movie was very negative. And I felt really betrayed initially at first when I saw the movie, because it was so different. But when I went back and saw it a second time, I understood it more than I did initially. And I started to realize that that initial reaction was a good thing, because it was something different, as opposed to going and seeing a Star Wars movie and having little to no reaction is not as good. So the fact that I had any kind of reaction at all is good, even though it was a negative one initially. But I did appreciate the movie more upon a second viewing. Tom?
I had a similar viewing experience as Tim did. It was opening night, but due to issues with the 3D, I had to wait until later show that evening, so that didn't help matters. There are some things that are good about it. There are things that are bad. I feel, though, that the reaction that it's getting from most fans is a bit too much both ways. You either have to love it or hate it, so it's been tough to even have a healthy conversation about the movie without either being too easy or too hard on the film in most people's eyes. The bottom line is, though, I don't think it is as bad as some are making it out to be, but it's not as good as others are pushing. So it does upset me, though, that they did go into this venture without any set plan going forward, and it shows. In the end, though, the fan reactions and projections and inability to really have any mixed emotions about The Last Jedi have really soured my whole experience.
You know, the interesting thing is fan expectations are very, very hard to manage. And that's one of the things I have a hard time with in terms of J.J. Abrams, because he likes to, as a filmmaker, he really likes to pack his films with all these sort of puzzle box mysteries that I get are intriguing. The problem is then fans go off and concoct these elaborate schemes and how, oh, well, this is what this means and this is what that means. And they come up with they answer these things for themselves in their head, which is great. And that's part of the fun of these movies. The problem then is that when they actually see the next movie or the next installment and it's not exactly the way they played out in their head, it drives them crazy, and people can't separate themselves from that reaction. And for me personally, I love the fact that there's lots of things that we didn't get an answer to, or that the answer was not what we wanted, because that's more realistic. That's life.
Yeah, the internet seeming to have like a knee-jerk reaction to this film to the point where some people are even afraid to talk about it, or at least how they feel about the movie anyway. I mean, and I thought it was bad when the prequels came out and people were divisive. I mean, this is just bad.
Problem with our time, I think, is social media has encouraged us all to have to have an instant reaction. The reaction usually tends to be like, hyperbole. It's dramatically great, or it's the worst thing ever, and so there's this knee-jerk rush immediately to weigh in with our opinion, like either yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down. And I think the problem is this was a movie that you really needed to process for a while. I very much felt the need to think about it for a while before I really, really kind of came down to where I was on this thing.
Yeah.
Well, unlike many others, I really have no investment in Star Wars whatsoever. I like it fine, but many were played by expectations going in. My only expectations came from the trailer, and really very little else. Maybe a little bit the comics made me excited, that was pretty much it. Upon first viewing, I liked the movie fine. I can perfectly well understand how many violently disliked it. To me, it was just fine. Of course, when I came back and I started thinking about it more and more, then the cracks start to appear, and I see more and more flaws in it when thinking back on it. So, yeah, I still think it's a fine movie, but it's not the movie that I'm in a hurry to see again anytime soon.
Well, now that we got that out of the way, the real reason we're here is that Disney just recently announced last week, as of this recording, the home video release of Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Bill, you have all the details on that. Why don't you fill us in?
Disney and Lucasfilm are releasing Star Wars: The Last Jedi on Blu-ray, DVD, and 4K Ultra HD on March 27th, and I believe it's the 15th that is the digital release a little earlier. The Blu-ray editions are going to include some nice extras, which is a feature-length documentary called The Director and the Jedi, audio commentary by director Rian Johnson, 2 featurettes, behind-the-scenes featurettes, one called The Balance of the Force, and one called Andy Serkis Live One Night Only, which is about his mocap work. There are 3 scene breakdowns for different scenes in the movie, and there are apparently 14 deleted scenes with an introduction and optional audio commentary by the director, and I think it adds up to about 30 minutes of material in all. And so what's interesting is this is also the very first Star Wars film that's been released on the new 4K Ultra HD format, and in terms of Disney's 4K releases, it's also the very first time they've included both Dolby Atmos object-based audio and Dolby Vision high dynamic range on one of their 4K Blu-ray discs. And then we know for a fact that there are 3 retail exclusives here in the US. There is the Blu-ray and 4K are available in Steelbook packaging at Best Buy. Target has both in special collector's book packaging. And then Walmart has a version of the Blu-ray that has interchangeable covers where you can slide different characters into the cover art, apparently. And unfortunately, and kind of frustratingly, there appears to be no plans to release a Blu-ray 3D version here in the US, though there are Blu-ray 3Ds coming out throughout Europe and the UK and elsewhere. And so that's a little frustrating, but I believe, and we'll have to confirm this when the disc comes out, but I believe that Disney's, some of their Blu-ray 3D releases are all region when they come out in Europe.
Yeah, let's hope so that you guys in the States also get to import and enjoy all that 3D goodness.
I think that's been the case on their recent Marvel titles, if I'm not mistaken. You guys, do either of you guys have the 3D for some of them?
Thor Ragnarok will be the first Marvel title not widely available in 3D.
Yeah. So hopefully that's what Disney's going to do going forward, is they might not have a 3D release here in the States, but the international versions will be all regions so that U.S. consumers can import.
Actually, I must correct myself. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the 3D version of Guardians of the Galaxy 2 was a Best Buy exclusive.
Yeah, and up until recently, that's what Disney was doing, is they were saving that 3D to be a retail exclusive. But for some reason, either that didn't happen this time, one of the retailers wasn't interested, or Disney just decided they were just going to streamline the whole process and not put one out here at all.
Well, let's be clear, though. There's like maybe that 10% chance that Star Wars could come out as a 3D exclusive somewhere. We don't have access to that information because the distributors won't give you that information, correct?
Yeah, the studios don't typically talk about retail exclusives. It's contractually in the agreement with the retailers that the retailers get to promote that for themselves. But then, of course, they don't talk to press, so they basically just put it in their ad circulars or on their websites, and that's how you find out, unfortunately. So it's been kind of traditionally confusing. And then there's another problem, which is that Amazon has been having contract disputes with Disney and other studios. So a lot of times pre-orders for upcoming titles by those studios just aren't available on Amazon. That makes it even more confusing. It's kind of a mess, but unfortunately that's the situation we have right now.
So a 3D release may be exclusive to Europe for now, but we are all getting the movie on 4K Ultra HD.
You know, if 4K is obviously a new format, it's only been around for a couple of years, and we get a lot of questions from people asking, like, what are the advantages of 4K? And it's a few things. Obviously, you get higher resolution. It's 4K versus HD. And so 4K, traditional HD Blu-ray is 1920 by 1080, and whereas 4K is 4096 by 2160. So it's 4 times the pixels, but a little over double the resolution, technically. You also get the benefit of high dynamic range, which on 4K, which what that basically means is that, like, the brightest brights are even brighter and the darkest darks are even darker, and that gives you a more natural range of light. It's more like what you see in real life, for example.
And that's what really makes the difference, isn't it? Because what I have read is that a TV, an ordinary 1080p TV with HDR, has a better image than a non-HDR 4K TV.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the key is that in addition to the high dynamic range, what's tied to that is you get a wider color spectrum. Because you have brighter brights and darker darks, you've got a much bigger range of possible colors. And so for example, current HD on Blu-ray allows you to see about 35% of the color that the human eye can see in nature, in reality. So 4K with HDR gives you almost 80% of that. You get a much more lifelike image. And I'll never forget, when we started reviewing 4K stuff, I reviewed The Martian. And you know, it was a very nice experience. But I had a reader email me who just watched The Martian in 4K, and he said, I think there's a problem with my TV. Because when Mark Watney's helmet, his astronaut helmet, when the lights on the helmet swept past the camera, my eyes, it kind of blinded me for a second. I've got to have this calibrated wrong. There must be something wrong here. And I had to reply and say, no, that's exactly what it's supposed to be. Because if you were actually there in front of Mark Watney and when he waved his camera light over your eyes would react. And that's the whole point, is this is supposed to be a much more natural, lifelike image, much more like what you would see, you know, in reality. But that throws people, especially home theater enthusiasts, because for years there are very sort of specific ways that you're supposed to calibrate your TV to get the best possible image. And some of those you have to kind of completely throw out with high dynamic range. And so at first it's a little startling, but once you get used to it, what you realize is that high dynamic range and the greater color depth, it's a much bigger improvement than the resolution increase. Because the human eye can only see so much resolution, can only perceive the difference of so much resolution. But those bright brights, dark darks, and all of that extra color is a huge thing. It makes every image much more sort of lifelike.
So that's basically the advantages of HDR, or high dynamic range. But there is a competitor to that title, isn't it?
Yeah, basically, 4K Ultra HD is mandated to have what's called HDR10, a high dynamic range. That's kind of standard on all discs. So Dolby has come out with their own standard called Dolby Vision. What HDR10 does is basically say, okay, in this movie, this is the level of the brightest brights and this is the level of the darkest darks. And they do that once for the entire movie. What Dolby Vision does is that it does that scene to scene and sometimes even shot to shot. So you can set all of those parameters for every shot, which of course requires more processing power. So both your player and your TV have to have the ability to support it. But and there's a lot of controversy of which one's better and which one is the one everybody wants. I personally think they're both great. I've been looking at Dolby Vision for quite a while because they originally considered it as something they were going to add to Blu-ray, regular Blu-ray, but they never did. But what I find is that if you have a really, really good display that can handle really bright brights and really dark darks, Dolby Vision makes a little bit less of a difference than HDR10. The problem is that, in these early years, not all displays really have that ability to show that vibrant color and that much brightness and that much darkness. And so the Dolby Vision allows the TV to kind of, by adjusting it scene to scene, you can kind of give people a better experience. But I will say that if you have a good quality TV, you should be very happy with either one. And then the other thing we have to remember is that when the cinematographers do the color timing on these films, they do a whole series of different color timings. They do one for a certain kind of, IMAX projector, a certain kind of digital projector, a certain kind of, so they do like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different color timings for all the different theater formats. Then they do one for home video on DVD, they do one for Blu-ray home video, then they do the 4K with HDR, then they might do the Dolby Vision one, and it's like, so there's lots of these different choices that they make, and I think what you have to just basically say is once you get to a certain level of quality and you've got a really good display, you should get a great experience whichever one you choose. The other thing is that Dolby Vision is a little bit more rare, at least on physical media. I think only about 30 titles out of the some 300 4K titles have been released thus far have Dolby Vision, and part of the reason for that is that they have to get the hardware out that has the chip that processes that, and that's taken time. But also, you have to pay Dolby a license fee to use it on every title, and not all studios want to do that.
But if you have a 4K HDR TV, will you be able to play back discs using Dolby's format on it?
It depends on whether your player and your display has a chip inside it that can handle it. So not all existing 4K content can do Dolby Vision. It's very similar to when Blu-ray was brand new. Like, the lossless audio was something that, like DTS audio and stuff, was added later after the fact. It's a little bit like that, but the good news is that every disc has to have HDR10 on it, so you will at least get that, and every display and every player has to be able to at least show HDR10. Going forward, though, the good news is that many manufacturers now are adding Dolby Vision, so it's really not quite the big sort of controversy that you kind of see in some places. Again, once you get to a certain level of quality, once you're looking at 4K resolution and even HDR10 and object-based audio, I mean, you're having an experience that's so superior to what you've had in the past that it's, you're kind of splitting hairs at that point a little bit.
So basically, people who are complaining that their 4K discs are upscaled from 2K masters really shouldn't be complaining.
Well, that's a complicated issue too. That's a lot like when HD was brand new and we had 16:9 TVs. A lot of people complained that, well, how come this old movie that was in 4-frame doesn't fill up my TV, and why are there the black bars and stuff? The truth is, older films that were shot on film, you can scan in full native 4K or higher, but they only have, depending on the age, they only have so much resolution information in them. Films that were made in the 90s and the early aughts, a lot of those were finished either at just HD resolution or 2K. So they don't have full 4K resolution. Now, a lot of films are being filmed in, maybe 4K or 6K, or they might, I'm using IMAX 65mm film, and then it gets scanned in that higher resolution. So you can do that, but even today, a lot of films are still being mastered to a 2K master, which is the digital intermediate. But what they do is they say, well, look, we might finish the film at 2K, but we capture it at 6.5K or 4K or whatever the case might be. The idea being is that the better quality of pixels you capture at that initial time when you're filming, the better the result's going to be, whatever the final resolution is going to be. Star Wars is a good example of that, because The Last Jedi, the cinematographer was Steve Yedlin, and they shot The Last Jedi on film, and so you can assume that they scanned it at 4K and that all the post was done at 4K, so it'll look great on this disc. But he, on his website, did a really interesting resolution demo where he shot scenes basically using 35mm and 65mm film cameras, and also using digital cameras at 2K, 4K, 6K, 8K to basically see what actually makes a difference and what can you as a viewer perceive in terms of those differences. And it turns out, once you get to a certain level of resolution, the eye has a really hard time telling between those various formats. You would think, oh my god, shooting 65mm, that's the equivalent of 8K, but you really can't see the difference in the end, necessarily. We're at a level now of quality where, shooting, it almost doesn't matter if you go too much higher. The point is to give you a great image and a great experience. And it's less about the numbers and more about the quality of the camera and less about the resolution number. But so if you go to his website, which is yedlin.net, YEDLIN.net, he's got a resolution demo on there. And I encourage people to go take a look at it because it's kind of eye-opening. You begin to realize it's not so much about like hitting a certain number in terms of getting quality. What you want is the very, very best possible presentation of that particular film, however it was finished, whether it was film or 2K or 4K or whatever. And then again, we have to remember that it's the high dynamic range that makes more of a difference than the resolution.
Yeah, because you're going to need a pretty big screen to start seeing the real difference from 1080p and upwards.
Yeah, it's very true. I think, I'm not sure exactly what the viewing the distance is, but there's a THX formula that basically says on a certain size screen, sitting back at a certain distance from that screen, the human eye can only really perceive resolutions up to maybe 4K, I think, and it's beyond that, it makes less difference. So, it really is, 4K Ultra HD gives you a platform by which to provide better quality for every film than has ever been possible before. Not every film is going to be full 4K, and not every film can be, and so that's the complication. But it's it's the numbers are less important than what the quality of the experience is if you're a fan.
Right, because one thing we decided we're going to probably do an entire show on, and we'll just touch on here, is, for instance, you have problems with films in the age of digital effects that the problem lies not in the physical filmed part, but the digital part. Meaning, for instance, certain effects that were done digitally obviously aren't even really done sometimes near 2K or 2K, but to do them in 4K, they'd have to be completely re-rendered. You've talked about this on the bits as far as like things like, I believe with like Star Trek The Next Generation, how they remastered that show.
That's exactly right. I mean, so that show was shot on film, and a lot of the models for the visual effects were shot on film, but they were composited digitally at standard definition resolution. So in order to get a really good high definition experience, they had to go back and scan all that film and then redo a lot of the visual effects digitally in HD resolution or higher. Tim and I were just talking about Frank Herbert's Dune on the Sci-Fi Channel. That was shot on film by cinematographer Vittorio Storaro, gorgeous looking, live action stuff, but all the visual effects were done at SD resolution. And there are Blu-ray versions out there that you look at, the visual effects look really terrible, and yet the live action stuff looks great, and that's just a problem. Some titles are just like that, and not every title is going to justify the expense of re-rendering everything in HD.
I happen to own the Dune 2000 TV series in Blu-ray. And it's really funny to look at because you have this amazing, crisp, clear picture. And then you have the sets that kind of look like film theater. And then you have the visual effects that look PlayStation 1 level. So yeah, that's
right.
Pretty interesting.
But to get back on Star Wars then, and to kind of wrap this portion up, you have the opposite problem when it comes to Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, because those films were, well, to use the term loosely, film. They were shot digitally at 1080i native, but the effects could ostensibly, as far as considering most of the movies are like 80% digital effects, could technically be re-rendered at 4K, but you still have the problem of the actual native shot stuff being at a very low resolution. So how is that going to marry in the end too? You have that issue as well.
Yeah, and in the end, there's not a whole lot you can do with some of that stuff. The things you can re-render, like in terms of effects, you can certainly do that, but your live action is only going to be as good as the quality of the capture system. Whereas the older Star Wars films were finished on film, and
right.
Those negatives have been scanned in very high resolution, and recently all of the visual effects for those films, the sort of digitally redone stuff, has all been re-rendered in higher resolution, so there are true 4K masters of those latest versions of those films, but not every film can do that. And then you look at older films, you might have an original camera negative that you can go back and scan in 6K or 8K, but the reality is the film is deteriorated, or the stock wasn't good enough, or the way the film was lit on set and the kind of lenses used, there just isn't that much detail in the image. What I've heard is you typically about 35mm film has about 3.5K of information ideally, but it depends on all the different factors that were happening on set, how it was captured, and was the film preserved properly, has it deteriorated, what the stock was. It's a really complicated thing.
Right, but this is the first 4K Star Wars film, and we could possibly then expect New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi at some near date in 4K at least. We know that much, and there has been rumblings, I think, of Force Awakens as well. So that's always a possibility on the horizon. So back on the Star Wars 4K, what are some of the advantages then, though, Bill, as far as this being the first 4K Ultra HD title as far as Star Wars goes?
Yeah, any new format is only as good as the titles that get released. If you have really good, exciting titles, particularly catalog titles, but also like the really big new release stuff, if it's going to get released on that format, then you're going to see that format take off. You're going to see really strong sales. That happened with DVD. It happened with Blu-ray. And already we're 2 years into 4K, and you're seeing major titles. I mean, we've had Blade Runner, and we've had E.T. and Close Encounters, and coming up we have Dark Crystal and
Jurassic Park.
Yeah, Jurassic Park, 2001: A Space Odyssey is coming, Die Hard's coming, and now the first Star Wars film. And after this, very likely the next one will be Solo. And then you could conceivably see later this year, early next, you could see The Force Awakens, you could see Rogue One. Episode, obviously, 9 will come out in 4K. And then the question will be, when do they go back and start doing the classic films, the Star Wars Empire and Jedi? And that'll happen eventually, I would imagine. And what's been surprising is that this format has sold better than Hollywood expected. And because they're now doing this thing where they package the 4K disc with a Blu-ray copy and also with a digital, there are a lot of consumers that have just said, well, I'll stop just buying Blu-ray only. When there's a 4K, though, I'll buy that and I know I get everything. Because even if I don't have a 4K player or display now, I'll have one eventually, and make a safer buy because I can it's future-proof, sort of. And I know, like Tim, I think you do that occasionally on some of these titles.
Oh yeah, definitely. I occasionally pick up things on 4K. I have a 4K player, but I do not have the ability to display it properly, which is something that I'm angling towards. So eventually I will be able to watch these things properly in 4K, but I do go ahead, if it's something that I really want and it's available in 4K, I just go ahead and buy it, because usually the price difference is about $5 difference more than the regular Blu-ray. And it includes everything that the Blu-ray has, so why not?
Yeah, I do the same thing unless it's a 3D release.
And Andre, I think you said too, you were into 4K and you've got a player and a display. And
oh yeah, absolutely. I have a 4K Blu-ray player, plus I have a 4K display. Regrettably, one that does not have HDR, but it does have 3D, so there is that.
Yeah, which is good. And the interesting thing is that this format, what surprised me most about this format is how cheap it is right out of the gate. The discs were only a few bucks more than Blu-rays, and the players started out, I think the most expensive player, to get a really, really, really good player, you can spend $500 or $700, but a lot of really great players are just $200, $250, $300, I mean, even less. And the TVs are so much less expensive than I would have expected. And that price came down right at the get-go. It was already lower than everyone expected.
There may be some national differences in this. I just have to say that to international people who will pay way more than that for their 4K content, such as yours truly. So.
Yes, exactly. But I know that an effort was made here in the States, especially, to start these. I think right out of the gate, the first players were in the $350, $399 range, which is, I remember the very first DVD players, were like $700-800, and the very first Blu-ray players were the same thing. There were a couple that were started at $1,000. So that's pretty aggressive.
Yeah, it did seem here in the States that they, at least on the TV side of things, I think that really helped push the adoption here in the US, because the fact that they were so affordable meant that not only could the enthusiasts afford them, but just average general everyday households could afford them as well. What I think Bill is kind of saying here, and to kind of sum this up, is obviously it's something that is worth getting into if you haven't already.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And an interesting thing is that the 4K Ultra HD Alliance has created a website called experienceuhd.com, where you can go, and they've got a lot of sort of interactive demonstrations where you can kind of get a sense of what these various things, what a difference they make, and you can get a lot of information. But the good thing is that 4K has taken off, I think, better than anyone expected. And what's nice about that is that I'm not personally a consumer that wants to buy all my movies digitally. I like having a disc. If you're streaming a movie, whether your internet connection is good or bad, or what kind of bandwidth you have, or how much traffic there is on the internet that day, you may or may not get a good experience. But with a disc, they can crank up the bit rate for video and audio. There's no interruptions. You're going to get the best quality. So I always prefer to have a disc.
There's also another argument there, which is really important for me. With a disc, you own it. It's going to be there. It's not going to go away. They're not going to take that away from you. Digital, you have that only as long as they want you to have it.
Yeah, it's true, and the amount of content available is determined by how much space they have on the servers. Do they decide this title's not selling anymore, so let's move it off and put something else on in its place? It's a little bit like Netflix or Hulu. You always have to go and check, well, what movies are on Hulu now and which ones are going away and which ones are coming. And it's like, I've had a lot of experiences where I want to watch a certain movie and I go and search: is it on Amazon Prime? Is it on Hulu? Is it on Netflix? And it's like, it's just frustrating to know. It's really hard. I mean, I'm in the business of keeping track of all this stuff, and it's hard for me to figure out what's available where and when and how you have to buy it. And that was the beauty of physical media for years, is with Amazon, pretty much anything you wanted was one-stop shopping, a click of your mouse, and 2 days later it was in your mailbox. And now it's gotten a lot more complicated.
Yeah, indeed. And that's a big issue I have, too. And I've ran into several issues with that, or I've read about, or even personally, to where, digital licensing can get pulled, can get changed. A lot of these digital venues only allow you to download them to a device once. So you're kind of at their mercy at that point, to where, like we said, when you have that physical copy in your hands, it's yours. It's, as long as you take care of it, it's always going to be there for you, pretty much, as long as it's able to be played.
Yeah. And Tim, I would imagine that's got to be frustrating with a lot of like indie titles and a lot of horror, and finding just good quality versions of some of those obscure titles, or some of those less like the things that don't traditionally like make blockbuster kind of money can be really difficult.
Absolutely, and there does seem like there's some kind of hope, because it seems like more and more deep catalog titles are getting bigger and better releases, but when it comes to streaming, you have no idea if an obscure horror movie from the 70s or the 80s is going to show up on Netflix, or most of the time they end up on Amazon Prime, I've noticed.
Yeah, and they're shitty.
Yeah, sometimes the quality is so shitty that it's not worth it, but, there's always an option, but it's just, what are you willing to do to go after that option, whether you have to buy something very expensively that's not readily available, or just simply sit and wait for something to be available.
And it's been actually pretty heartening to see how many deep catalog titles, really, stuff that I've barely even heard of, are coming out on Blu-ray. Like, these independent studios are finding ways to get this content out to an audience that really loves it, and that's pretty exciting. That's why I fear, I don't think physical media is going away anytime soon. I think I've talked about this before, is what I see is digital will be kind of the mainstream way people consume, and then collectors and fans will still be on physical media, and there'll always be kind of a niche audience there. But I will miss that day. If there ever comes a day when there's no longer discs, I will miss that day, because we will lose out. We will lose out in terms of these great experiences, and we'll lose out on the process of discovery of things maybe we didn't know about.
And bitrate. We'll lose out on bitrate too.
So in one way, though, then it's showing that there is a bit of a glimmer of hope out there when it comes to not just the smaller titles, with these independent companies being able to bring them to the masses unlike before, and even digging out catalog titles from studios, as far as like how Criterion and Shout do, films that normally wouldn't get as much notice in a release that get a little bit more notice. We also have the fact that, like you said, Bill, 4K is really pushing physical media back into the limelight again.
Especially for the diehard fans. And I think if I had a message, and I suspect Tim will agree with this, if I had one message for fans of this kind of content, these kind of movies and all that kind of stuff, the ability to watch this stuff at home, if I had one message for fans of this stuff, it's buy discs. Because the more you buy discs, the more they'll sell them, and the longer we'll keep this market alive. And that's really the key. Digital is not going to keep alive these niche markets and these different genre things. And if you love this stuff, if you love home theater, if you love this kind of experience, you got to keep buying discs.
Absolutely, I agree with Bill. The Shout Factory, and not just Shout Factory, but companies like Twilight Time also do this, where they will get a title that they know will not sell, but they'll also get a bigger title that they know will sell, so it'll pay for that other title. So it's always important to buy the smaller titles as well, maybe the titles that you've never heard of, that you have a mild interest in. Those are the titles that really need to sell in this format. As far as Shout goes, the Thing that they put out, that will always sell, but they also put out a movie that I love called I Bury the Living, and titles like that, these obscure films that, if you have a mild interest in them, definitely buy them, because they're worth it, and you're basically supporting your industry and supporting it to put out more stuff.
Absolutely. And even when it comes to big movies, because it's really important to note that with all these buyouts, licensing issues, mergers, what have you, you could theoretically lose your entire digital library and there's nothing you can do about it. Of course, this will touch on a future subject we do plan on getting into, which is going to be the streaming wars as well.
Yeah, you got Amazon and Disney are kind of now competing with Netflix. They're all kind of vying to control that, dominate that sort of digital market, that digital landscape. And you know what's going to happen is the consumer is going to lose. You as a fan, you're going to lose out. I mean, you've got these giant corporations, vying for market share and everything, but nobody's making it easy to be a consumer of this content when it comes to digital. So what a lot of people are just doing is just like ripping things off or going to YouTube and watching things for free. And it's like the industry is almost going out of its way to make digital too complicated. And it's really hard. It's really hard to follow it and keep track of it. Eventually they'll probably figure it out. But that's really the problem is, every studio wants to have their own digital system now. Every studio, every network, every retailer. And so what they're doing is they're creating their own exclusive content, or they're buying up exclusives on certain kind of like titles, and it becomes really, really consumer unfriendly to try to know what to get where and whether you're going to get to keep it and how long you're going to have access to it. And that's a real shame. That's a big, big, big backward step, I think, for this industry, for the home video industry.
So that topic, among many other ones that we covered in this video, will become the subject of future Talking Blue episodes, or even, I guess you would call them sideshow episodes or spin-off episodes, that will concentrate more on specific titles and subjects. Isn't that right, Andre?
Yes, that is about right, because we will be having some very cool discussions about some very cool genre properties coming your way very soon.
And there is no end to the amount of conversations and topics that we can have, that's for sure.
Well, that seems as good a place as any to wrap things up for this episode of Talking Blue with the Digital Bits here on Midnight's Edge. I want to thank Bill and Tim for joining us as always. And you can find them on The Digital Bits, where you can get your latest news on DVD, Blu-ray, 4K, and even digital.
That's absolutely right.
Besides there, where else can they find you?
You can find me at Bill Hunt Bits on Twitter and Facebook. There's also at The Digital Bits on Twitter and Facebook. And of course, we write every day on thedigitalbits.com.
Tim, where can people find you?
And also, you can find me at facebook.com/Tim Salmons, or just Tim Salmons on Twitter. And also, if you're interested in a lot of movie TV spots and things like that, you can always go to YouTube and check out my channel that I run there called Movie and Video Game TV Spots. It's a really cool channel. Do check it out.
And Andre, you have a special announcement as far as Twitter goes, do you not?
Yes, I am pleased to announce that Midnight's Edge, once again, has an official Twitter account. So be sure to follow us at midnights_edge. Also, you can follow me at Andre Einharjad.
And besides here in Midnight's Edge After Dark, you can find me on our Facebook group, as well as Twitter at Thomas Connors Jr. So I want to thank our panel once again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you once again real soon here on Talking Blue with the Digital Bits on Midnight's Edge.
Absolutely. Take care.
If you like this video, then please hit that subscribe button. Due to recent changes made by YouTube, we also encourage all of our subscribers, both new and old, to please hit that bell icon next to the subscribe button as well, so you will be notified when new videos are uploaded. Be sure to check back for news and analysis of the happenings and corporate politics behind the scenes of your favorite genre movies, as well as explorations of your favorite characters and their backgrounds and context here at Midnight's Edge.